Good morning. So, thank you for the first three talks. It's a brilliant intro actually to what I want to talk about. And I guess the first thing to say is, I think each of those topics, shared space, so kind of human, pedestrian-oriented environments, green space, the green spaces of the city, and movement are all clearly in and of themselves good things. And you set out very eloquently, I think, some great examples of where those places work well. I guess what we know from our experience at Cambridge over the last few years is that those things often come into conflict with each other. Two good things, or sometimes one good thing, can undermine another good thing. So for instance, thinking back a number of years, there were proposals for a guided bus connection across Colgan's Common, where the sort of objectives of public transport, speedy public transport that would reduce congestion, came into conflict with the purpose and pleasure of a green space. So I'm here today to talk about the importance of design as a tool to reconcile, negotiate and balance those different competing demands. So as was already said, I'm Kieran Perkins. I'm an architect and an urban designer. I work at a company here in Cambridge called Fifth Studio. Fifth Studio was founded about 20 years ago here in Cambridge. About 10 years ago we opened an office in London, and recently we've set up a base in Oxford as well. And we work extensively across those three cities, which share a lot in common in many ways, and also across the broader southeast. And as a practice, we've always been interested in the full spectrum of the built environment, right through from large-scale infrastructure down to very particular spaces, rooms, places, buildings. And I guess we've been always fascinated by the relationship between those scales. And we think that I'll explain more about that later, but this is a sort of expression of that, I guess, which is a drawing that we did for an exhibition at the Royal Academy of Arts, which is based on the Haven ports, and it thinks about that relationship between new infrastructure as a sort of background setting and for new development and for good places. So as I said, we're architects, we do buildings. But we're also into the sort of larger scale thinking. We like to think big, and this is an example of it's a park project in East London between the Thames and the Olympic Park, which was to do with a big strategic idea, but realised through, which is the drawing on the left, realised through an incremental set of smaller landscape and small architectural interventions all along a river route to stitch together a bigger idea of a park. And as citizens of Cambridge, we're particularly interested in its streets and spaces. And this is kind of an instance of that where we got involved with the Milton Road scheme a couple of years ago through writing an article in the Cambridge Architecture Association's Gazette. So the first thing I want to talk about is urbanism. Now, I guess when we're thinking about movement and streets across the city, we very often think of that as a kind of network. And I think this point has already been made in the earlier presentations to a certain extent. I think what urbanism as a discipline does is force us to think at a city scale in terms of the spaces between buildings. So this is just a drawing of all the buildings in Cambridge with everything else turned off, so that you can see that streets aren't purely linear things. We can think of them as the spaces between buildings. And I think as citizens and as urbanists, we want to be considering everything that's not the buildings, if you like. It's all the spaces in between and the way that we experience those. And clearly, the shape of those spaces in between, the sort of inverse, the negative of the buildings that our city's made of, they vary massively, and those differences are fundamental to how we experience the city, our feeling, the character of those spaces. So this is a range of sort of samples of different places, from central Cambridge, Helsinki, Copenhagen, the Science Park in Cambridge, another research university district. And you can see the plans at the bottom, they look very different, and on the ground, the photos at the top, they feel very different. And they've got very different land coverages as well. So the figures there give you a sense of the proportion of area that's covered by buildings. So the second thing I want to talk about is the need, while we're designing, to sort of zoom in and out, we think, from the macro to the micro. So on the one hand, I think at this point in time it's vital that Cambridge starts to think seriously about an integrated public transport system for the entire city. I think to date that hasn't happened. The city deal ought to be the place where that can be thought through. And so I guess that's the kind of most zoomed out, strategic way of thinking. But we have to be careful because we've been in this situation before. Back in the 60s, this is Logie's plan for the roads at Cambridge at that time. A pretty bold strategic idea, so they were doing the big scale thinking, but perhaps without enough sensitivity to what that meant on the ground. So this is a Photoshop montage that we made of what that might have meant for my neighbourhood. So this is York Street with a fire. And this happened in lots of cities around the country. Now, thankfully, York Street was spared. The Geldart is still there. But we're still living with a sort of insensitivity, if you like, to, in terms of Robert's discussion about shared space, how those different functions might be thought about more cohesively in a more integrated fashion. So those big scale plans were about separating everything and dealing with conflict that way. And actually I think we know today that there are much cleverer, much smarter ways of doing that. And even at the street where there's only 2 or 3 cars a minute perhaps passing through here, we're still not doing that. There's a safety barrier there for what I'm not quite sure. So even at that micro scale, as well as making sure we haven't got flies coming through and destroying everything, we need to think much more sensitively about how our public spaces work. Now, the sort of depressing thing is this isn't new. For 50 years or more, people have been railing against the, it's a bit like the Ben Hamilton Bailey drawing of what we've done to our cities in terms of accommodating the car. And through the amazing Gordon Cullen drawings, sort of setting out a pathway to restoring that. So this is the sort of town centre that's been destroyed by roundabout signs and whatever, and thinking about a kind of incremental approach to restoring these places to more civil, pedestrian-focused places. But the depressing bit is actually, even 50 odd years later, we're still in some very prominent places in Cambridge, which has a very good reputation for placemaking compared to lots of places in the country. We're still making some pretty depressing engineering-oriented spaces, brand new. So we've done a lot of work for Transport for London. One of the bits of work we helped them with was their Roads Task Force report, and I guess it's already been acknowledged. That was an attempt to think in a sort of a subtler way about that balance between the movement function of our streets and the place function. And through the bit of work that we did with Transport for London, we defined a kind of matrix of different street typologies, if you like, from ones that are at the top more oriented towards movement, to on the right ones that are more oriented towards the kind of place function, if you like, so that more significant as places to be. And we help them explore what the kind of common general characteristics of each of those different sorts of places are. And I think that's a useful starting framework to think about these places in a subtler way. And I guess one would hope that in Cambridge we're going to be talking about, we're not going to be talking about the North Circular type road, but we're going to be talking about the more place-oriented streets. I suppose the tension is how we still accommodate the movement function within that. Now, the thing is, I don't think that's the end of the story, though, because even if you've got your kind of 9 typologies to fall back on, that give you a bit more of a sense of what the important issues are in any particular street type, there's still an enormous amount of complexity that streets engender. They have to cater for all sorts of different modes of transport, different calls that people have on it in terms of its function as places as well. And that's an incredibly complex story. And I guess one of the key challenges, I think, is to ensure that the way we think about those uses design thinking as a tool to negotiate those competing demands. And what I've got here is 10 sort of thoughts about how design does that. So the first is about diversity. So as to say, if you take any particular stretch of street, I think what a good designer will do will look at it and start to acknowledge and enjoy the diversity of environments that you find along it, as opposed to perhaps a kind of purely movement function attitude. So if you're building HS2 or the M6 or what have you, there's a sort of technical flow dynamic that is the sort of primary issue. But if you're talking about city streets, we need to bring an alternative way of thinking, or an additional way of thinking, which is about acknowledging the diversity and difference along that route. The second aspect is about questioning and exploring and refining the initial brief. And I think one of the problems with much of what's happened with the city deal so far is that the initial brief was either too definite or wasn't challenged and developed enough. As with a building, the first and probably most important task that a designer does is to question and explore the brief to make sure it's the right question that you're asking before you actually start to make proposals. And this is a plan which was part of that article to do with Milton Road, which made the point that if you do zoom right out and think about a public transport network that can bypass the congestion of the city, that will work as a sort of whole system, it might be that you don't actually need to. It might be that you don't need to put bus priority down Milton Road at all once that full system has been. So this was proffering, and this again, it's not necessarily as straightforward as that, because this proposed reconfiguring Newmarket Road as a means of bringing, which is in desperate need of some action to make it a better place. If you could bring bus priority along there as part of reframing that road, that gets you almost to, it gets you 1/3 of the way out to Milton Road, with the top third having already been completed by the new bus connection to the station. But the tricky bit, perhaps, is the bit in the middle, which is between the new station, Cambridge North, and Newmarket Road, which would be the rail corridor across the meadows, which in itself, along Stavridge Common, which in itself brings a whole set of challenges. So this isn't necessarily the answer, but it feels to me like if the brief had been drawn widely enough or challenged, there would have been an opportunity to at least explore that as an alternative to see how it measures up. And I guess fundamentally that's the point. The design is about a process, and it's about testing lots of alternatives and seeing what the consequences are on the ground before making a judgment. Third thing, and I'm probably going to run out of time, Peter, so I'll get as far through the 10 as I can. The third one is to co-design. So it goes without saying now that you have to consult, you have to engage people as you make designs to make sure that through that process of testing you're doing the right thing. But equally, you need to ensure that interests are fairly represented and accounted for. And my experience, I have to say, on Milton Road, and I think if you look across the demographic of this room, for instance, it's very easy for consultation to be, well, not to take account of everyone's needs, simply because not everyone will be present or even realise what their needs are. Fourthly, look beyond the highway boundary. So again, this is an example of Milton Road, where we've promoted the idea of trying, through positive engagement, to bring in areas beyond the actual highway itself. To draw things in a way that people can relate to, so to avoid abstract plans and sections, and to populate them with real people, real vehicles, with trees and what have you, so that people can get a better feel for what's being proposed, rather than seeing bald engineering drawings. To carefully analyse what exists and observe how people use it before you make any moves. So this was some analysis we did a few years ago on the marketplace. To make sure that you're always innovating. So just a couple of examples of sort of cutting edge thinking in terms of how trees are accommodated in a way that makes sure that they last and thrive. On the right hand side, that's a pretty funky bus stop in Manchester that was produced by the Transport Authority there as a test piece. So it's a bus stop that is all singing and all dancing. To accept that many places are background, necessarily low cost, but that if they're carefully detailed, they can still be good. And this is where design is really important. A designer's fee is a tiny proportion of the overall cost of a scheme, but it's through it's through design that you can transform something that's low cost into something that's amazing, just through carefully detailing it. The thing doesn't have to cost more as long as it's well detailed. But also know when to splash out a bit. So there will be instances, there ought to be instances, where you go to town a bit. Everything shouldn't be budget. So this street in Oxford we're developing a scheme for, and the special thing here in the light fittings, they don't come out very well on the slide, but they're these beautiful bespoke light fittings that that sit up as a sort of constellation of stars up at the top there. And then the last and probably most important point is to make sure that urban design, landscape and public realm proposals are developed in tandem with proposals for movement rather than as add-ons or infill. And the way to do that is by creating teams that are design-led, with the final product being a product of negotiation, mediation, consultation and the skilled and elegant resolution of multiple impact inputs.